Good afternoon, everybody. In my book, it's still afternoon. For some people, it might be late afternoon or early evening. But welcome very warmly to Kellogg College. My name is Annette Pludeman. I will be chairing the session. I'm a fellow here at the college, and I also work in the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine. So this is a warm welcome to the launch of our pandemic evidence collaboration, which we have set up as a program of work to identify and develop and implement strategies to generate high-quality evidence for non-pharmacological interventions during pandemics and to inform policy and care decisions. So that's a lot, but that's what we plan to do over the next few years. And we have tonight, for this event, invited two speakers to talk about some of the issues and some of the questions that we face. And we'll have the two speakers speak, and then we'll have questions from the floor at the end. And also, just to let you know, there is a photographer who is taking images. So if anybody has a major problem with having their photo taken from behind, because it will mostly be from behind, just raise your hand and let us know. Otherwise, hopefully everybody's happy with that. So I'm not going to spend any more time talking because we want to hear from our fantastic speakers. So we have our first speaker is Professor Sunetra Gupta, who's a professor of theoretical epidemiology at the University of Oxford, and will talk to us about the use and misuse of modelling studies. So I'll just load that up for you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much indeed for this invitation. It's a great honour, and I start by wishing you every success in this very important venture. So I realised that I'd actually promised John that I'd talk about the use and misuse of modelling studies during the COVID-19 pandemic. What is their optimal role? I realised I'd given him this title after I had carefully put together my slides. So hopefully it will still obtain, but it's not entirely just what I'll be talking about. So I'm a mathematical modeler, and I work on infectious diseases. But generally speaking, I've stayed out of the kind of circuit of using mathematical models to provide advice to governments. And right at the end, I'll explain exactly why I've done that. But so what is it? What made me want to contribute or have a voice during this particular pandemic? Well, the reason I got involved was really this. I didn't say so at the outset, but my motivation for becoming involved was that I could, right from the start, I felt that we really could not afford lockdowns, and for reasons that I'm sure will be very obvious to you. And so that was my starting position, but what I felt I needed to do, because my expertise is not in this area, was really first to try and address or to come at it from the point of view of a mathematical modeler and try and talk about some of the problems that we had in using models to come to any clear policy decisions and certainly to justify lockdowns. But eventually, so that's how I started out, and exactly 4 years ago, by just trying to attack the issue of, can we tell how the pandemic is going to unfold? What do we know about its features? I also, because although I'm a mathematical modeler, I actually run a lab trying to make a universal influenza vaccine. So we also became involved right at the outset in trying to set up serological tests to try and ascertain how many people had already been exposed to SARS-CoV-2, which is what I was trying to push as something we needed to measure before we could come to any kind of understanding of how far it had spread, and therefore, in a connected way, what its actual infection fatality rate was, and various other aspects. That didn't work, so eventually I just had to come out and say, you know what, actually my real worry, my real concern is that we can't afford lockdowns. And eventually in sort of September, October of 2020, I and others, Carl and Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff in the States, we started thinking about how to tackle what we could recommend as an alternative policy to lockdowns. And we came up with this idea, which we loosely call focused protection, where we said, given that the infection fatality rate has a particular age distribution and also clearly affects people with certain conditions, certain comorbidities, that because we can define who are vulnerable really to severe disease and death, that an alternative to lockdowns, whose stated aim was to stop the spread altogether, was to shelter the vulnerable and allow, rather than imposing these measures on the entire population, which would have the added benefit that the virus then would spread as it normally might, and this would allow immunity to accumulate in the population. And of course, we stressed that one should nonetheless continue to invest in therapy and vaccination. And on this slide, I have this fourth point, which, just because it exercised me, that the response was so local, so nationalistic, and we thought it was important to think outside national boundaries. So these were sort of roughly, generally, the kind of things that we put out there at the time, and one of manifestation of which was the Great Barrington Declaration, which Martin, Jay and I put out in early October. Now, all of these efforts were met with great resistance from the scientific community, and the immediate response to the Great Barrington Declaration was the John Snow Memorandum, which was published in The Lancet, which put forward essentially three different objections, if you like. Not points of debate, not sort of queries where, or points that they felt we should think about or consider, but simply points on which they appeared to be convinced, or that they felt completely demolished, undermined the basis of what we were saying. So they sort of distill into these three elements. The first question they asked was, what if there is no naturally acquired immunity to SARS-CoV-2? This was quite surprising, given that it was October. We'd already had at least 6 months of very serious laboratory work on SARS-CoV-2 immunology, both looking at antibodies and T cells, a whole range of immune responses to this new novel virus, and it was well established that these existed and were very, besides which there were in circulation 4 other coronaviruses, 2 of which were very similar, belonged very much to the same family as SARS-CoV-2, and we knew perfectly well that one did make immune responses to these viruses. What we did also know was that the immune infection blocking immunity to the other coronaviruses was not lifelong. So this second question that they asked was valid in the sense that it is entirely true that immunity to SARS or to most coronaviruses is not lifelong, as it is, for example, with measles. But what was strange about this was that they felt that this was a real problem, that this somehow caused an impediment to, or meant that we couldn't really put in place these ideas that we mentioned in the last slide. The third point, so I'll come back to these. And the third point, which again was something that should have been a discussion point, and it's a question we're still asking ourselves, of course, is can you shelter the vulnerable? Of course, the way it's posed, the John Snow memorandum actually posed it, was that you cannot possibly shelter the vulnerable. But as such, there is validity again to that point. Well, how would you, in fact, shelter the vulnerable? So we'll come to that in a minute. So let's first think, I've already dismissed this. This is absolutely bizarre that they would come up with this. But let's address this issue. What if immunity doesn't last forever? Because as I said, that is actually correct. Immunity against infection to these coronaviruses is short-lived. Well, in order to understand this, what this all boils down to is this idea is really the concept. What it really speaks to is the concept of herd immunity. So what we were saying in those recommendations, the first slide, what we were saying could be achieved by simply protecting the vulnerable is that allowing the virus to spread through the population would cause the build-up of immunity in the population, which itself is a bad thing for the virus, and therefore we would, by allowing people to acquire immunity, we would in fact impede the growth of the virus and cause the risk of infection to fall in the population. So that was a sort of basic underlying principle here. And this is a slide I show my undergraduates where I talk about how the reason we study infectious diseases in our biology department is because it's an interaction between two species where we are the hosts to the pathogen, and so we get infected, and then when we recover, we become immune, at least for a certain period of time. And it's the accumulation of immunity or immune individuals in a population which effectively, in ecological terms, corresponds to the pathogen or the parasite consuming its own resources. And this is why it's desirable for us to have a level of herd immunity in the population. So now we finally come to the mathematics. So how do you understand this dynamical process? What's the best way to understand it? Obviously you can just articulate it as I have done, but that just tells you what happens in a single snapshot, if you like. But what exactly is the dynamics of herd immunity? How does it build up? What happens to it if you stop, if you then lose immunity? Is it, as the John Snow people were suggesting, is it impossible to actually maintain herd immunity if you lose immunity so quickly? This is also something the KC and the recent COVID inquiry kept positing as if it were an actual truth, that you cannot attain herd immunity if you lose immunity. Is there any truth in that? Well, in order to understand that, the best way to understand it anyway is to write down a mathematical model, and this is the simplest mathematical model you can have for the spread of a disease, in which you split the population into those who are susceptible, infected, and recovered, meaning immune, and you sort of have a sort of plumbing diagram taking people from being susceptible to being infected and then recovering and becoming immune. You can write down a set of equations, and from those equations you can derive an expression for this term R0, which has been bandied around, which is fundamentally a measure of the fundamental transmission potential of a pathogen. And R0 has to be greater than 1 for it to grow at all. And what happens if it can grow is that you see this kind of a dynamic in this very, very simple model where nothing is happening except susceptibles are becoming infected, in fact, are recovering. Nothing else is happening there. What you see is the infected start to grow. They grow. As they grow, they recover, and the recovered compartment in the blue starts to also expand. And then eventually, at a certain point, the numbers infected start to decline. And that's because the proportion of the population immune has crossed what we call the herd immunity threshold, which is related to R naught by the simple expression. But what happens at that point is that the pathogen population simply can't, its growth rate turns negative. And so it starts to decline. And in this very simple model, it will actually disappear, because what happens here is the proportion immune grows and stays. Obviously, it stops growing once the pathogen has disappeared, but after that, it just stays at a particular level, which is higher than the herd immunity threshold, and so that's it for the pathogen. That's what happens in this extremely simple case, simple situation. Now, of course, in reality, even for something like measles, the proportion immune will decline, just because people who are immune will start to die. And then once that happens, the proportion of population immune drops eventually below the herd immunity threshold again, and you get a second wave, and this goes on for a while. So then it has a second wave, which causes the proportion immune to bounce up again above the herd immunity threshold, then it comes down again, and you get a succession of waves, and eventually it sort of settles, the whole system settles around this herd immunity threshold. Obviously, there will be seasonal fluctuations here, but that's what we call endemic equilibrium. That's where we are headed. And the idea is, the general idea of vaccination, for example, is basically if you can keep the population at this threshold through vaccination, or above this threshold. If you keep the population immune above this threshold, in theory you can eradicate the disease. But even if you just manage to keep it at that threshold, which is what we've done for measles, for example, you will maintain that sort of endemic equilibrium or go just below it. And the idea there is, of course, that you bypass the state of being infected by taking someone from being susceptible to being immune through vaccination, and then that's all a very good thing. So you get herd immunity and you're done, and this is how, this is what's suggested by this very simple model. So why didn't that happen? Why aren't we here now? Well, the reason is because, as actually correctly pointed out by the John Snow memorandum, with SARS-CoV-2 and other coronaviruses, you don't just stay in this immune state. There is loss of immunity against infection after a certain period. And so what that means is you cannot just take people or create herd immunity through vaccination, because you'd have to keep vaccinating people in order to maintain it. But what it does mean is that we will stay at this endemic equilibrium through natural infection. So there is no barrier to the establishment of herd immunity, or for us to reach that endemic equilibrium, that condition, which is the best we can hope to do, really, with most diseases, and certainly with ones where you cannot vaccinate your way to the herd immunity threshold. The best you can hope to do is to, through natural infection, maintain the herd immunity threshold. So what this means is that the misconception that the John Snow people were labouring under, is that if you lose immunity, you can never get there. And that's simply not true. In fact, the herd immunity threshold is exactly the same for pathogens that have the same R naught, irrespective of whether you lose immunity quickly or if immunity is lifelong. And the way I sometimes explain that is by using an analogy, a cistern analogy, so where the sort of level in a cistern is as naturally a constant and is determined by the characteristics of whatever the mechanism is causing the valve to shut. But if the cistern can leak water, if it leaks water slowly, then water will dribble in slowly but maintain the same level. Whereas if it leaks water quickly, water will rush in quickly, but you'll still maintain the same level. So measles is like a cistern where the water is dribbling out slowly and trickling back in slowly, whereas SARS-CoV-2 and other coronaviruses are systems where the water is rushing out or fairly quickly and rushing back in very quickly. But effectively, the herd immunity threshold is similar, and what you have at any point in time is a significant proportion of the population who are unable to be infected. If you then add into a model which does incorporate the loss of immunity against infection, an SIRS model, so that you go back from R to S, if you add in some seasonality in transmission, which is here shown by the black lines as a periodic change in the actual herd immunity threshold, which, as I said, is linked to the basic reproduction number, then you can recover a whole range of patterns which essentially can explain pretty much any of the observations concerning incidence of infection or disease that we have observed in various regions in the world, and in fact can very easily explain why, depending on the time of arrival, whether the virus arrived just before there was a sort of peak in transmissibility, as in just before the winter season or just around the time of winter, when there was a peak, as it did in New York. You see a big peak occurring then, followed by relatively smaller peaks, whereas in Arizona, it didn't get there till the summer, so you had a much smaller peak because it didn't arrive in time, and then you have a bigger peak in the following winter to kind of catch up. So all these patterns can be, here's a sort of simulation showing how you get all these different patterns depending on when the virus arrives. So you can, essentially what I'm trying to say is you can actually explain the epidemiology, that the dynamical, the data that we have on the incidence, the dynamics of SARS-CoV-2 can be explained purely in terms of herd immunity and seasonality. And there is no need to invoke NPIs to explain these patterns, meaning that it is very difficult to use these patterns as they have been used to demonstrate that NPIs have been effective at reducing spread. In fact, most of the studies indicate that, given the differences between different regimes, NPI regimes that were adopted, and the similarity in different localities, if you do even eyeball sort of the dynamics in different regions with completely different means of, who implemented completely different ways of trying to control the spread, it is very difficult to say that any of these NPIs worked to achieve their stated goal, which was to slow the spread of the virus. Of course, at that point, one of the things that happened shortly after all of this, the John Snow memorandum and all of that, is that new variants started to creep up. So then the focus shifted a little bit towards the evolution of the virus and how there was this potential for it to keep changing and become worse. And those two were based on very flimsy ideas, really. And if you simply write down a mathematical model, again using that sort of SIR framework, but expanding it to include more variants, what you can deduce very easily is you can't say anything about whether a variant is actually precipitating a new wave, whether it is more virulent or more transmissible. None of these things can be said with any certainty from the mathematical models that could possibly explain these patterns. And indeed, the idea that Omicron was sort of miraculously became less virulent is not supported by any of these simple mathematical exercises. What is much more likely is that Omicron had appeared at a time when a lot of the population, most of the world's population, had been exposed to SARS-CoV-2, and therefore the virulence of Omicron was reduced in the sense that most of the people that were being infected for a second time. Which brings me to another feature which is very important that needs to be incorporated into any kind of thinking about the dynamics, which is that although loss of immunity against infection occurs regularly, and reinfection takes you back to being immune, your first infection is very likely to confer durable protection against severe disease. I mean, this is true, it's likely to be true for all the other coronaviruses, and is reflected in what we've seen, I think, since the beginning of the pandemic, or it's supported by that. So fundamentally, of course, that is what justifies developing a vaccine, provided you are focused and aware, focused on the prevention of severe disease and aware that that's all that the vaccine can possibly achieve. So these various features of SARS-CoV-2, which fit in also very nicely with what we observed in terms of susceptibility increasing with age or with certain comorbidities, can be exploited, as we said, to potentially shelter the vulnerable. Now that was met, as I said, with great skepticism and derision by this community, by the entire scientific community, which is unfortunate. But having said that, of course, this is a question. How can you possibly shelter the vulnerable? Well, in fact, all of us made various suggestions. I didn't feel it was an area that I could make a huge contribution to, because I'm not an expert, but someone like Carl is, and I think he did come up with a number of important suggestions. And indeed, in the Great Barrington Declaration, Martin and Jay also came up with a number of ideas. But these were all met with great resistance, and it was odd because it seemed strange that people were willing to believe that certain measures would actually contain the spread of a virus, but that these same measures somehow would not be able to protect the individual. In fact, it really is, of course, the other way round. Their logic was that once it had spread to a certain extent, that no matter what you did, people would get infected. But I don't think that that's correct. And again, if you were to sort of think about focus protection within some sort of framework, this is not a mathematical one, it is worthwhile thinking of what happened, what the alternatives actually achieve. I mean, if you lock down, so if this is a population and the smaller circle is your vulnerable population, if you lock down, you're trying to put a ring around that entire population. If you have focused protection, you're just protecting the vulnerable. Now, what the main problem is, we don't know whether this will work. Now, if it works, then okay, everyone stays protected, and then eventually the vaccine arrives and you either vaccinate the vulnerable or everybody, as it turned out. But the logical thing here would be to just vaccinate the vulnerable. If it doesn't work, you're actually in the same position as if you had let it rip, if you've done nothing at all. Whereas with focus protection, if it doesn't work, sure, you are in a let it rip position. But if it works, you have avoided the costs of lockdown. And eventually, if a vaccine is developed, you can, I think this, one of the colours has gone a bit. What should happen here is that the rest of the population under this situation will acquire immunity naturally. And then you're left in a situation where the vulnerable are less at risk, but also once there's a vaccine, there is the option of vaccinating the vulnerable. The other thing to consider is the vulnerable population is a dynamical compartment. Those who are vulnerable will die, the elderly especially, of course, and be replaced by other, and those people who are now moving into that age class will not be vulnerable because they've already been exposed. So these are sorts of things one needs to actually put into a framework when you're thinking about implementing these ideas. So what I'd like to put to you, because you're sort of looking at this whole question of do the NPIs work from an evidence base, is my question to you is, can we, I mean, obviously these are ideas, but we want to be able to test them. And that wasn't done during the pandemic. But of course, there are opportunities now to set up experiments to look at how we can protect people, I mean, to monitor, for example, infection rates with flu under different focus protection strategies. So can we set up RCTs to create a sort of evidence-based for focus protection? Because it's all very well to say, oh, well, it might work, this might work, that might. What you really want to be able to do next time is say, focus protection works. And one of the, I mean, obviously that requires some careful thinking, and I'd like to suggest to you that maybe this is something that you could incorporate into some of what you're doing. How do you test it? Obviously that you'd have to set up RCTs that actually specifically look at these issues using some other, probably not SARS-CoV-2 anymore, as the metric. But this is just one example of a paper where I think, I mean, this was an observational study, which does give you a sense that, yes, indeed, shielding can work. And this is a study done in, well, this is data from New York, where, as I showed you, there was this massive peak in April of, 4 years ago. And what was found in this study is that women who, these are data on exposure in women who were at point of delivery. So women who were in their final stages of pregnancy, when at point of delivery, had an exposure level that was about a third of what it was in the general population. suggesting that these people who, either because they were heavily pregnant or because they didn't want to wander out into a pandemic situation while they were pregnant, had effectively managed to reduce their individual risk. And so I think we should do things. One is that I think focus protection may be perhaps better replaced by this idea of individual risk reduction, which could be either voluntary or even mandated if that's what people want. But if we think of individual risk reduction as something we can achieve through the means which, in fact, were completely useless, in my opinion, at stopping the spread, but are actually very good at protecting an individual, then if we start to think about that and start to test how we can achieve individual risk reduction, perhaps we can create an evidence base for focus protection. I think that's where we might want to head. So just to finish on what I think went wrong and why, I think there was an inversion of the schedule of certainties, in that what we were actually least certain about, if we were to apply, for example, the precautionary principle to this situation, what we were least certain about was the effect of NPIs on the transmission dynamics of disease and the long-term goal of such interventions. And this is where I think mathematical models are not very useful, and this is why I didn't, up to this point, actually get into this game. In fact, this is a paper, just an essay I wrote about 20 years ago, in which I talked about how scientists run into the danger of using mathematics to give the illusion of certainty when there is none. And that's exactly what happened, and that's where they were misused. We had some uncertainty regarding the fundamental biological properties of the virus, but far less than was broadcast. And I don't think Wesley's here today, but last meeting we had in Kellogg College, Wesley Park talked about how this uncertainty was weaponized. And he, I think, it was a very good way of putting how people behaved about some of the sort of scaremongering that surrounded some of the fundamental properties of the virus. There was one thing that I feel we were absolutely certain about, and that was that NPIs would cause extreme and long-term damage to the most vulnerable. And sadly, that's what we're seeing now. Thank you very much. Sorry if I've overrun a bit.
Thank you very much, Sunetra, for a really interesting talk. And we now have Professor John Conley, who is a professor of medicine, microbiology, immunology, and infectious diseases at the University of Calgary, and he's also a Kellogg College visiting fellow. And John will talk to us about the need for conducting randomized controlled trials in pandemics to provide high-quality evidence.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm going to speak about generating high-quality evidence and overcoming the challenges to be able to do that during a pandemic. Just some disclosures first. The only one of pertinence would be that I was involved in a trial with the Staph aureus vaccine that was funded by Pfizer, but all of the money went to the University of Calgary for the research nurse. I received no personal remuneration. Then I'm on a number of other groups that are advisory in the public domain. The learning objectives, just to lay them out, is to just briefly touch on the polarization of COVID-19, and then to talk about the background of randomized trials versus observational studies, and why we need randomized trials in pandemics and epidemics for multiple types of interventions to try and give us the best and highest quality evidence to help inform policy. Outline some examples in a RCT with which I was involved in the COVID era that we were able to successfully complete, and then overcoming those challenges as we move forward. So just by way of background, this was the first major pandemic in the age of instantaneous social messaging. We had a parallel infodemic that's been described by the WHO and we saw social media in total overdrive and very highly emotional views. I'm sure we've all lived through that and looked back. Vaccinations, I'm for them, I'm against them. I'm for interventions, I'm against them. And there was very strong advocacy and strong opinions from no measures to COVID zero, which is complete lockdown for 3 months, and then we come out and there's no more virus present. And it occurred across the political spectrum, and including mainstream media, physicians, academics, and scientists. And I think we all lived through that. I know it varied by country, and I'm told the Scandinavian countries were a little bit less so, certainly in Canada. I think in the UK as well, we had, take action, a national response. Let's pull the Emergency Measures Act that came out from groups in Canada. Others, no, we're not going to do COVID zero. We had front page headlines. You don't copy losers, says doctor who was pushing the COVID zero strategy. So you saw very emotional and strident opinions on each side of the spectrum. So that's where I'm going to come in and say, well, we need some evidence to help to be able to guide us. And just to give a brief history of some of the randomized trials, it's, sort of grew out of the experimental studies in the early 20s, looking at laboratory animals where we've got experimental and controls. And the concept first came about in 1923, so it's a long time ago. And the first RCT has a unique UK history. Sir Austin Bradford Hill and colleagues looked at streptomycin, which was a new drug, versus bed rest. So bed rest versus bed rest plus streptomycin. And they launched this trial. Actually, it's quite a unique history. I've put some of the references down at the bottom. And it was an astounding result at 6 months, 4 out of 55 mortality versus 15 out of 52. And this is progressive pulmonary TB. So it was very dramatic. They learned quickly about resistance as they followed them out to 12 and 18 months. But this led to this UK MRC trial. It's considered a landmark and really led to a turning point of bringing RCTs into the forefront of clinical research. And I put a graph there on the right, if this works, here to show the UK led the world in randomized trials. They've fallen off now, and the US continues to be there, and also low to middle income countries where there are more and more trials being done in that regard. And then we saw the polio vaccine in 1954, just to remind you about that, March of Dimes, and this was the killed Salk vaccine. And they actually managed to do a randomized double-blinded placebo-controlled trial. And there was huge controversy at the time. There's a book written about this. And if you think COVID was polarized, go back and look at polio at that time. And the same issues were occurring. They had John Enders, a Nobel laureate in virology, saying killed vaccine won't work. We need a live virus vaccine. And then you had Salk himself saying it is unethical. We cannot do this study double-blinded. And they had all these meetings and the March of Dimes, and they actually finally came to the conclusion that they're going to do it. And there were like 600,000 children. And the parents agreed at the end that they wanted to see this. They wanted the best possible results to know if it was going to do, but they did add in an observation arm. And the people who actually really pushed this were the medical officers of health. They wanted to see it done, and so were the parents. So they got by the ethical challenges rather than let's just give this vaccine to everyone. And that was a monumental study as well that was produced in the United States. And we then saw what happened in 1961, the thalidomide tragedy, where there was a company that was promoting a drug for pregnancy, and we saw this global epidemic of phocomelia, cleft lip and palate, and stillbirths. And that led to regulatory agencies that over the next 8 or 9 years, thou must do randomized trials for your pharmacologic interventions. So when new drugs are coming out, you must have that availability. And that thalidomide tragedy was a real turning point to be able to force randomized trials to be able to provide answers after what was considered a major global tragedy in 1961. And the power of randomization, a great reference by Sir Richard Pedo about the magic of randomization versus the myths of observational and real-world evidence. Of course, he got a lot of letters about that, but nonetheless, it was a provocative title. But focused on the known and unknown biases and how randomization really reduces that and how important it is, and that it can be used for multiple types of interventions, for medicinal agents, for vaccines. And we saw the tremendous number of vaccine trials during COVID, also non-pharmacological hand hygiene, masking, closures could be used there as well. And they're considered the best evidence and the gold standard, although there's some dispute, and I'll touch on that, with people using big data suggesting that it can match the power of a randomized trial. And certainly that spilled over into the COVID-19 era in non-vaccine related trials. With observational studies, classically they're useful for knowledge on causes, pathogenesis of disease, and also for prognosis and diagnosis. Events are as they naturally occur and are followed along, but there are tremendous numbers of biases, confounders that can occur inherent in any observational study. There's just no way you can get around it. People adjust following the study, but then you can have unknown confounders that still are retained in there, and I'll give some examples later. So RCT is considered very optimal for prevention, control, and treatment of disease. There are recurrent debates over the years about the merits of randomized trials versus observational studies, and they're sometimes concordant, but sometimes not. But when they're discordant in a big way. Think of the retrolental fibroplasia, blindness from use of oxygen in premature infants in the 1950s. Observational studies were suggesting in the late 40s that you needed more oxygen for the preemies because they're premature, and so let's crank it up and give it for longer periods. When I was preparing the slides, my wife said, "Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize. I thought they were born blind, but I know all these people my parents spoke of in the 50s that grew up and they were blind." Well, it was probably because of too much oxygen for the premature infants at the time. And this was actually a global epidemic. There were tens of thousands of children across the world that were given too much oxygen. And they finally decided to do, well, let's do this new randomized trial. And again, this was hailed as a benchmark study because it showed the duration of oxygen was what was driving the fibrous overgrowth to cause the blindness in these premature infants. So again, a golden answer. And this is taught in all our epidemiology classes. Fast forward to 2000, the New England Journal, Benson and Hart suggested there's little evidence that treatment effects in observed studies after 1984. So anything before 84 or the 80s, those are old studies, and we've learned now we can use observational data. And they did a review of 136 studies and treatment effects and said methodologic rigor, quality, and analytic strategy, and we're as good as the gold standard. And then major failures started ensuing. And some of you will remember this, the hormone replacement trial that came about. And that was a major issue because for years it was recommended on observational studies alone that you give women who are menopausal, they get hot flashes, give them hormone replacement therapy. And that was a sort of standard of care. The Women's Health Initiative, and good for them, they decided let's do a large mega randomized trial. And then suddenly they started showing year after year for 4 or 5 consecutive years increases in heart attacks, strokes, venous thromboembolism, and realized that something's not right, and also breast cancer. And they actually canceled the study. They closed it down. They said this is a very major harm in these people. And so that taught us, again, the power of the randomized trial. And a lot of this had been pushed by the pharmaceutical industry to give hormonal replacement therapy. So again, another classic example where the RCT came out on top. And others, vitamin E protection for cardiovascular disease, beta carotene for lung cancer. And a recent review that just came out last year that showed the discordancy between observational studies in cancer treatment are discordant by 55%. Compared to randomized trials. So if you wanted a therapy for your cancer, would you say, I like the observational studies from the registry, or you say, I want a randomized trial evidence for my cancer treatment, for myself or my family member? And I think that's important to recognize. There are discordances that have been as recently as 2023. So important, and for pharmacological interventions, we saw at an unprecedented rate in COVID, and lightning fast in February 2020, the Research Forum, large adaptive randomized trial platforms. Some of them were on the shelf or oven ready, and they were able to employ them. And by the 21st of April, there were over 500 clinical trials already registered globally for antivirals, monoclonal antibodies, plasma vaccines. They were just going at a galloping speed. And then by late 2022, there were 17 trials in over 360,000 patients. And we had vaccines that were really going great guns. And by March of 2022, 11 billion vaccine doses had been administered. That's a phenomenal approach that was used to be able to bring these out to trial. And then here, somebody in our group today as one of the co-authors, public health measures, so non-pharmacological interventions. They did an editorial in BMJ and found when they did a linked systematic review where they wanted to look at those that were done for the interventions, like the public health measures or non-pharmacological, as we call them. So no agents that had a pharmacological effect, a biologic effect in the body. There was only one, which was a masking study, and 35 other studies that were found, and they were all in the area of doing pharmacological interventions, or actually hundreds of them, but of the 35, only one was found that was eligible. And they considered this a pandemic tragedy, that more randomized trials were not done to give us the same quality of evidence we saw with the vaccines and the antivirals. And then as far as clinical trials for PIs and NPIs, fast forward into another study that was done. And this group published this, I think, in 2022. They looked at the first 18 months and looked at 5 databases and also looked at the registries. And they found over 4,000 registered trials for pharmacologic interventions and only 41, so 1% of the studies that were registered or ongoing for non-pharmacological interventions, so closures, maskings, international border checks. 9 were published, and when you do that, the others were ongoing or were stopped. You were down at 0.3% of over 4,200 studies were actually looking at non-pharmacological interventions. And at the same time, we saw 9 published studies on NPIs versus 26 in chloroquine alone. But by 6 months, there was a harm signal with excess mortality in a huge Nature paper on the randomized controlled trials because we all heard about the chloroquine consequences. These authors pointed out as a dichotomy, 1.5 billion children globally were mandated in school closures. And we've now seen a big systematic review from McMaster suggesting that they weren't really that germane in terms of the transmission in schools. But despite trying, a Norwegian group tried to do a randomized trial, but again, many difficulties. But it would have been great to have that before we started closing schools in that setting. Another group in February 2023, to bring us up to that point, this group looked at 5 NPIs, and they looked at the use of CO2 monitors. They looked at masking and school closures, and then also ventilation in schools and business closures versus ivermectin, chloroquine, and convalescent plasma. And you could see that there were 130 studies in the 3 that they were doing for randomized trials, and they found 2 studies in the entire group, and yet CO2 monitors in the United States in some settings were mandated. You had to carry the monitor around and monitor what you were doing with no evidence to be able to support it. And they were quite strong. They said that this is a double standard in evidence. And they said that the NPIs, nobody wants to study them. The outcomes are too diffuse, they're ill-defined, they're emotional. And that's what these authors commented on. And it was actually telling to look at that paper. And we know there are failures in COVID-19 in observational studies. Hydroxychloroquine was considered based on a mechanistic finding that it's going to work against this virus. Small observational studies started showing there's a positive effect. They didn't stratify the original studies by comorbidities, but this didn't stop the US from granting emergency approval by 2020. And then by April 2021, suddenly there were increased mortality. And a recent study that I found in preparing just recently, 2024, they've looked at 6 countries and have recorded 200,000 hydroxychloroquine deaths due to people taking it based on the observational studies. And then prone positioning, and we have some of our group involved with that as an NPI in intensive care. Many observational studies suggested you improve your oxygenation, lung injury, decreased intubation, and they were suggesting maybe mortality. And then a big randomized or systematic review of randomized trials showed all the secondary outcomes. There was no difference in all of those, but there was an improvement in the decreased risk of intubation. So again, the power of the randomized trial. So one study that we were engaged with, and I'll just go through this quickly, it was a study of the N95 respirators, so the tight-fitting ones versus medical or surgical masks. And I use it as a case study, and thank you to Mark Loeb for some slides here. We conducted this trial. I was involved in our center. It was a pragmatic international multi-center non-inferiority trial and for providing care for patients in the hospital. And this is an area that hospitals had to look at. We had approval from all 10 boards, and there was a data monitoring committee. And it was a pragmatic trial. And this is important that this is different from an explanatory trial because you have to know the difference. Explanatory are often best circumstances, homogeneous population, and you choose your participants carefully. A pragmatic trial is you expect the imperfect conditions, you expect heterogeneity, you expect real-world conditions. So those are differences, and often you get a blend between pragmatic and explanatory. And it's my belief that pragmatic trials for NPIs can be done. So this was the medical mask group and an N95 group. We did a pre-trial survey. We didn't publish this, unfortunately, because people said there's no equipoise, but we had a survey in Canada that showed indeed there were 75% of our colleagues out of about 400, 125% response suggesting, yes, we need to do this study to help inform policy. And then the study was completed with a number of challenges, which I'll touch on, and it achieved its adequate power, and it showed that the use of medical masks were non-inferior in both to the N95 in both groups in the hospital. And the medical masks, we had a high rate of follow-up, good adherence, and I'll show that in a moment. It was in both the original Wuhan strain and then right up to the Omicron strain. So we actually covered it through all of them, both in high-income and low-income countries. And we had 90% power looking to enroll 875, enrolled 1,004 patients. And there was auditing by monitors to look at adherence. And we knew that there was some infections likely from a household, but that would have been evenly distributed between both groups. And here's a survival curve. It shows the same thing. No differences in the secondary outcomes. And importantly, because there was a lot of criticism that you're putting healthcare workers at risk, there were no ICU admissions, no deaths, and 3 pneumonias in each group. So totally equivalent between both of them. And we looked at adherence, both self-reported and also monitored adherence. And we had thousands of observations. And, if you look at the graphs between the two groups, not much difference. And we found, which I considered to be more important than adherence, 98.3% continuous wear noted by monitors to their assigned mask in the medical mask group, and 96.6% in the N95 group. So pretty equivalent, which is what a randomized trial tries to do. But the comments that were published in the annals and the social media, which I'll talk about in a moment, it was unethical. It was a flawed trial. There was no control group. RCTs are not superior to other forms of evidence for NPIs. Respiratory protection was not used continuously. One of the surgical masks used in the study didn't meet some standards. There was differences in some subgroups. even though it was a post hoc, which just is a hypothesis generating, concerns about fit testing. It was not adequately powered. People took their N95 masks off, although it was to be originally on the care of the patients, but then everybody said it's universal masking, so as soon as they came in the hospital, they had to wear them, and we've got data to show that that was the case. Biases, a change in sample size, well, that's because we had to start censoring people after they had a dose of vaccine. Lack of equipoise was a very common criticism, and 24 months for fit testing, no program, and some modifications to the trial registry. A part of that was because it just didn't get reported into the journal. So there was a lot of criticism, and this is a microcosm gaze into a macrocosm of challenges of doing an NPI-related randomized trial. Sheer sample size issues for adequate power, and you'll see that in school closures, business closures, consenting at the individual level. In a pandemic, you have to do it by distance or elsewhere. Supply chain challenges, communications, financial, and I'm just going to try to finish up. Some of the biases occurred in this trial. They're just bias against the use of an RCT for an NPI in a pandemic. We had harassment of our investigators. We had misinformation campaigns, letter writing to our hospital ethic boards. They wrote to everyone and said this study has to be canceled. Misconduct allegations sent to the Tri-Council Federal Office. Advocacy to limit recruitment. Letters were sent out to union leaders telling the nurses not to apply. And we were constantly attacked on social media. And I quote this book. It's actually a bestseller on Amazon and Foreign Affairs. It's by two authors, and it's called The Weaponization of Social Media. And we saw that a lot on this study. So challenges to studies, I'll just touch on fundamental opposition by some scientists and academics. You cannot do NPI randomized trials. And in fact, I was disappointed to see that the Royal Society report in the UK making a suggestion that policy approaches made trials of NPIs almost impossible. And that was their report, which I disappointing. Confirmation bias, Sir Francis Bacon, British statesman, actually talked about it. It's a strict adherence, almost an insuperable belief that anything that occurs has to fit into that belief that it can or cannot be done. Intellectual bias, attachment to a point of view, and others have contested that and said it's obligatory ethically. If there's uncertainty or harms, you must do the trial to be able to see it. And this is in Scientific American, a trial against the hierarchy of evidence, and I'm just going to close in a moment. They said placing randomized trials above other types of research, and you see at the bottom end, has no basis in science. So you can see that this is the ultimate in confirmation bias in this regard. Thankfully, we've got groups within the WHO in the end of October, or in October towards the end, they talked about uncertainty in a pandemic, give randomization the chance to give you trustworthy evidence, generate large-scale randomized trials during a pandemic, and they actually talked about embedding trials within the inter-epidemic and epidemic period, and to do them right in the context. So overcoming the challenges, I would say the 3 E's, advocate for the resources to deploy randomized trials for both NPIs and PIs early, equitably, and energetically. I call it the 3 E's. Build resiliency and preparedness. Ensure all benefits and harms. We have to look at the harms equally to the benefits. Provide oven-ready research protocols, and that's something that was perhaps lacking during the pandemic. And then build partnerships. And to those who say it's not possible, I'm going to quote a great British statesman, because I'm in the UK, I'm from Canada. If we are working together, if we are together, nothing is impossible. If we are divided, all will fail. If Sir Winston Churchill said that doing the impossible is possible, I believe, if I'm going to follow his advice, doing a randomized trial for non-pharmacological interventions can be done. It should be done. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, John, as well, for a really thought-provoking and interesting talk from both our speakers. So I will invite you. I'm aware, at the end of our time overall, so maybe we'll close the session, take maybe 5 or 10 minutes, possibly. So a few pressing questions is what we can take in the time that we have left. So if you could also maybe sort of keep the questions quite concise, if that's all right, then I shall hand over if anybody has any questions they would like to ask either of the speakers or.
So
Thank
there
you.
was no mention of long COVID in your presentation at all. And so I wonder where that comes in, because if you just protect the vulnerable, then you expose more people to the potential for long COVID.
Yes.
Which is it's pretty devastating and debilitating for those who have it.
For those who have what, long COVID?
Yeah.
Yes, that's true of, many viral infections carry that risk. The reason why it was so evident during the pandemic is because a lot of people got infected at the same time. But it's a risk we live with normally, so you have to balance the harms of preventing yourself from acquiring a viral infection and getting long COVID or long flu, getting post-viral, against the harms, so it's a question of whether it's a reasonable trade-off. I think most people would say it's not, because the consequences of locking yourself up, let's just take it at an individual level. Let's say you don't want to get long COVID, so you're going to stay locked away during this time.
What I was trying to make is, if you're going to have protection of the vulnerable, is there any way of determining those people who might be vulnerable to long COVID, for example?
I don't know.
Okay.
But that would be true of, most people who get these post-viral illnesses. I think one of the good things about long COVID as such was maybe that it focused people's attention on, or made it seem to those who doubted that that these things exist. The post-viral, sequelae we know that they are there, but sometimes they are dismissed. So, it's important that we recognize that there is such a syndrome, and because it all happened at the same time, it became kind of an issue. But I think it's not clear who and why you might end up with such an unfortunate situation, but it's not one that normally stops us from. We've already made that calculation. Is it worth not being ever infected by a virus because you might get these sorts of consequences? And I think the answer is very clear.
Any other questions? The reflections? Yeah.
You got a lot of flack for advocating herd immunity. But you are obviously right. Well, why did you get such criticism?
I don't know. Yes, I did. Of course, part of it was just some of these ideas became, as John said, they became religious beliefs rather than scientific opinions.
People who knew better ignored what they knew about herd immunity.
Well, by that point, some of the people in SAGE who had been advocating for the build-up of herd immunity had suddenly flipped around and decided that was the worst thing that they could ever do. And I guess they just decided they wouldn't budge from that opinion. And then there was, of course, this sort of idea that it was communitarian to lock down, whereas I would argue it is more communitarian to take the risk of getting the virus so that you do build up herd immunity, which then leads to a situation where the risk is lowered for those who are vulnerable. So I think there was just a sort of inversion of the communitarian principle as well, and people became zealous, and then of course there were organised campaigns, and it all became sort of just exploded. Something very unfortunate.
Yeah.
I'm very struck by both thoughts, they're both excellent, but I'm very struck by the idea that we only did 2 randomised controlled trials of MPIs. We've not done a single one in the UK, and we've spent £400 billion. And therefore, with 200 policies that we enacted in 2020 alone, nobody can put the finger on a single one and say, aha, we've got some evidence or evaluation. Particularly at the COVID inquiry, it doesn't want to look at the evidence because it knows we can't evaluate that. My question, therefore, is why did we throw out the window really an evidence-based approach that we've probably spent 30, 40 years trying to build, and overnight it went completely out the window, and it didn't get repaired in 3 to 4 years? And I guess that's the question to both of you, in a way. Why did, and I'm still trying to grapple with that issue of why we threw it in the bin overnight.
Sure, I can address I think I mentioned there are significant challenges to non-pharmacological NPI randomized trials to try to build that evidence. A financial one thing that I think is probably true, and I mentioned it, is in the pharmacological, the vaccine trials and the antivirals, they had things sitting on the shelf, already developed protocols. Nobody had thought that we need protocols. There were some that were done, and I think the Pakistani mass trial that had 300,000 individuals. So it can be done, but it's difficult. There's no question to be able to manage to do them. But for some reason, there wasn't enough political will to design and conduct. We did the one in Canada, and then a couple of other countries that we had to expand to, but took a lot of flack during that study as well for reasons I've not totally understood. But those are the barriers, and you just have to work through them. I think definitely having oven-ready, on-the-shelf protocols that are adequately powered, and then to think through all of the logistical issues, because I have trouble accepting it cannot be done or it's impossible to do a large randomized trial. So Richard Petto spoke at the WHO meeting about mega randomization trials. He gave the example of the millions of women in a breast cancer trial. Why can't we do that with school closures, with workplace closures? Surely we can do that because of the consequences that can occur. And I'm a big advocate for planning and trying to do those, and to do them perhaps on smaller scale in the inter-pandemic or epidemic areas when we get influenza, because then at least you can field test these things.
You want to?
I think there was a drive to maintain the illusion of certainty. And, look, the model says if you just, you set up a Sims model and you make people not go to school, and the virus disappears. So that, that to actually do an RCT would be questioning. That would be saying there's no certainty there. That could happen, but you don't know. And I think there was a resistance to that.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe one final question, perhaps, and then we will close. If anybody has, at the back, yes.
Sorry, that's okay. Good afternoon. I just wanted to put a perspective on this business of we can't run randomized controlled trials. We can't prepare randomized controlled trials, and we can't run them during pandemics. This is nonsense, and they have been run. They have been prepared during 2005 to the period 2005 to 2009, and then run once the button was pressed from June 2009. And I refer to the trials of the so-called pre-pandemrix and then pandemrix, which was the GSK influenza pandemic vaccine. Other farmers also had pre-approved protocols with ethical clearance and so on, and they'd run a whole series of run-in trials. And then when H1N1 was identified, they changed the antigen from H5N1, which they'd been running in these preparatory trials, to H1N1, and then went on. Not in America, because this had an adjuvant. The vaccine was with an adjuvant, and Americans do not, FDA do not allow that, CBR. Thank you.
Right. I think on that note, because we are out of time, and it is because we've had such a really two wonderful talks, I think with a lot of things to think about, and hopefully you'll have an opportunity to think about those as well as you go away. So thank you very much for joining us. And I would say watch the space. We are the Pandemic Evidence Collaboration. We have our website as part of the Kellogg College website sort of homepage, because we are hosted here by the college. And so thank you also to Jonathan and Vicky for that. So if you want to know about what we're doing, that's where you can find out about that and keep in touch with the work that we're doing. So thank you very much for joining us, and I wish you all a lovely evening. And thank you again to both our speakers.